I think what I've come to say is that first of all, as Christians, we are living in, multicultural Britain, but we have to accept that our government and our systems don't always get what actually being a Christian really means. And that will get us into all sorts of things. But when you think about it, it's actually quite hard to explain what converting to a Christian means, particularly to someone, and I'm talking in Azade's presence. I mean, she can articulate it much more than me. But what does it mean to totally abandon everything that your community, your family, your society, everything that it stands for? And I think I didn't even get that myself. I mean, I grew up, in a Christian home. I became a Christian when I was 7. I've always been a Christian. I didn't have to abandon everything when I accepted Christ. When I went to live in Pakistan back in the early 90s, I'll never forget, I had a shock one day. I went to a nun, a Catholic nun, said to me, "Come and see the community that I'm working with." And I turned up, and it was a graveyard, it was a cemetery. And these Christians, minority Christians in Pakistan, were living amongst the gravestones. That was where their homes were. They were in the graveyard. And that totally shocked me. But at the same time, they had a satellite dish. They had lots of wires everywhere. Pakistan is great for wires and satellites and things. And they were watching Dynasty and Dallas on the TV. So their view of what the Western world is like, what Christianity is like, was Dallas and Dynasty. All the women walked around with massive big power shoulders in puffed red sort of jackets, and they all lived in these amazing houses, and they all kind of swanned around in big cars, and that was the only thing they saw of the West. And here they were living as completely sort of second-class citizens in the graveyard. And while I was in Pakistan, there was an issue that came up. I was there as a BBC journalist, and it was the Pakistani government wanted to introduce the fact that everybody had to carry an ID card. Now, we carry our passport, but the ID card was to say what your religion was. And even at that time, I didn't really get it. I didn't really understand what having your religion would be like in your ID card. We fill out a form in the hospital, don't we? Sort of what's your religion? And most people sort of still put down probably C of E. But for those minority Christians, it was a huge issue that if they put down their religion on their ID card, if it wasn't already apparent from the fact their name is Masih, which, as you might think, comes from the word Messiah, but actually Masih is quite a derogatory term. So I covered that story and realised that they really did live, very secondary class citizens. But I didn't really understand what that looked like until I started doing the job that I do now. Then I moved to Vietnam, and living there, I don't know if anyone's been to Vietnam, but Vietnam has a very Catholic identity. I mean, the French colonized it. They lived there, for many years. So you go to Saigon, there's a wonderful big cathedral right in the middle of, central Saigon. Christmas, you can celebrate, despite the fact that it's a communist country, you can celebrate Christmas. In fact, they all love Christmas because they think Christmas is totally about Father Christmas. They don't have the Jesus bit and the birth, but they have Father Christmas, except if you go to the very strongly Catholic Christian suburbs of Saigon, and I was taken there. And then you see the big crib sort of scene, but it's actually the whole side of a house is kind of turned into a wonderful sort of manger. So the communist Vietnamese kind of country has this very odd idea, Christmas, Father Christmas, etc. But what I noticed in Vietnam is it's okay if you're Catholic as long as you don't challenge or question the government. If you challenge or question the government, you get taken to prison. And the other thing that is very noticeable in a country like Vietnam is if you're a Protestant, then you are Tin Lin, which means people of the word, but you are really, again, second class. Now, the American missionaries came to mostly the highlands of Vietnam. There's a lot of sort of very remote rural areas, and they converted Vietnamese in the tribes to Christianity. But one of the ongoing issues now is a lot of those Vietnamese, they might be American Baptist type Christians, if you like. They are really persecuted for their faith because the communist government says, you know, you're a sect, you're American, you're being infiltrated by the Western imperialist power that is America. And so one of the issues that I report quite regularly now is how they flee over the Vietnamese border into Cambodia. And then Cambodia treats them really like dirt because they're tribal people, they're a minority ethnic group, and they say, we don't want these people in our country, thank you very much. And so there are cases going on, and they go on for years, about these Vietnamese, almost all of them Protestant Christians. So those two experiences. And then I moved to Nigeria. And I was living in Nigeria, and again, Nigeria is a very strange country. I don't know, again, if people have been here, have been to Nigeria. But what you notice is that in the south, there's all these mega churches with, you know, amazing sort of preachers that sometimes have their own private jets. And then you go up to the northern part of Nigeria. Now, I thought that northern Nigeria was predominantly Muslim because I had this kind of idea, you know, the British colonial system ran Nigeria until the 60s, and essentially the colonial power that we let the Muslim sheikhs and sultans effectively rule themselves, and we left them to it, particularly after independence. And so I thought northern Nigeria was very much a Muslim, and in fact 12 of the states in northern Nigeria are Sharia states. But actually, that's not totally true. In some of these states, it's about 40% Christian. So it's not like they're a tiny minority, like 5%. It's actually 40% of the people living in a Sharia state are Christian. And of course, then you also know the, you will have all heard about the Chibok girls. Now when that happened, the interesting thing is, a few weeks before that case, I was talking to somebody who does a lot of research in Nigeria, and they were saying, Julia, we've written this report, and it dates back to 1999. Now, the Chibok girls were kidnapped in April 2014, but right back to 1999, the sect that became Boko Haram, they actually deliberately set out a strategy that they were going to kidnap women and girls from the minority Christian communities in northern Nigeria, because if you kidnap the girls and if you rape the women, or if you take these girls for your bride as a Muslim community, you not only then forcibly convert the girls to Islam, but you can also you can really destroy the whole spirit of the Christian community that they come from, because in that culture they're very much seen, once they've been kidnapped, they're just seen as their family, as, you know, totally sort of worthless and shamed. It's a very big honour and shame culture. And so the girls, they might be married off to a much older man. They probably will never come back to their family, but even if they were to come back to their family, then they cannot, they can't be received by the family by and large, and particularly if they've had a child. And UNICEF did a report about this a couple of years ago, and they said, you know, what's really hard is for these Christian communities to accept the girls back again, because they have such a strong culture that they see the child that has been born of the rape, they see them as a sort of son of the devil. And so it's really, really difficult, and there's lots and lots of interviews. So this is a strategy that is being carried out in northern Nigeria, and yet you won't hear a lot about this. When the Chibok girls were kidnapped, I remember my colleagues at the BBC were reporting it, and we had this figure of about 275 girls were kidnapped, but they were taken from a secondary school in a predominantly Christian community. Now, we live in a very multicultural city. You know, we don't have an area that you can identify and say that's the Christian village, that's the Muslim village. But in many of these countries and many of these places, you will be able to know who comes from a Christian community, who comes from a Muslim community. So so that's just a little bit of a background on the situation in northern Nigeria. And then, of course, you overlay all of this with lack of employment, lack of job opportunities. If you are discriminated against from the time you're a child, you know, when you go to the school, your name makes you stand out as a Christian child. You can't get the educational opportunities. You don't get to go to university. You can't go for the same kind of jobs as many of your Muslim friends in your class or your university. That kind of builds up a whole thing. You know, as a Christian, I'm never gonna get anywhere in this society. And if you are from a Muslim background and you convert, as I said at the beginning, you lose everything. And as a day, maybe you're going to talk about this, but that really came home to me when I went to a conference at the Vatican actually a couple of years ago, and one of the theologians there explained, you know, it's everything to you. It's your culture, it's your language, it's your family, it's your friends, it's the everyday life, the way, you know, your family, you know, observes religious holidays. And so for somebody to convert is absolutely immense. And I've just finished reading a book, and I'm going to stop here because I'm conscious we need to catch up a bit of time. But I've just finished reading a book by a man who very sadly died a couple of weekends ago, who you'll have heard of him, a guy called Nabeel Qureshi. And very simply, he explains this so well. He grew up he was born in Pakistan, but when he was about 7 or 8, he moved to his family. His father's job moved them to America. And so he grew up, so he was born Pakistani boy, very devout family. His mother had come from, her parents had been Islamic missionaries, Muslim missionaries. And he found through his teen years and growing up in an American school, he had, you know, school friends in his class, and they were Christians, and they started debating with him. And of course, his parents were extremely devout, and he knew the Quran. He'd read the Quran a number of times, and he was a real Quranic scholar. And so his book is called Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. He actually explains what it's like for somebody who's grown up with their family, who are, you know, obviously a very loving, very dedicated, devoted family, and what it meant to him to finally give in and acknowledge that actually he wanted to follow Christ, not Allah anymore. And so for me, that kind of put a human story on what I'd heard at the Vatican University. But the difficulty is that Muslim convert, or that young, unemployed, discriminated against Nigerian, then comes to this country, and they think, great, you know, I've come to the West, England or Britain is a Christian country, I'll be okay, they'll understand me. And unfortunately, when they get here, it's often not true. And hopefully we're going to unpack that a bit more. But that's just a little taster of what I've experienced and what I've learned from my time so far. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia.